Welcome to Community Christian Church. We are so glad you are here. My name is Ed Martin, and we're in this series called Adulting. And I want to start with a question that probably a really good speaker wouldn't ask. I'm going to ask it anyway. Anybody here just tired? Now, maybe not. Maybe you woke up this morning and you were so full of life, you thought about drinking coffee, but you thought, nope, caffeine for me would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. Maybe you looked at yourself in the mirror when you woke up and you thought, wow, you are so full of life and vitality that I just want to go to work today. I'm so ready to get at stuff. But maybe not. Maybe that's not the way you feel. I want to talk to you today as a part of this series, Adulting, about a command of God. And it's a very good command. It was meant to be a gift to us. And if you're here and you're not a follower of Christ, you don't really consider yourself a Bible person, or you're not a church person, my guess tells me that even you at some point in your life have heard the term the Ten Commandments. And you know that at some point in some religious literature, God gave people 10 commandments. And you might not be able to name the 10 commandments. You might not be able to get one or two out of the whole 10. But when you hear that they include things like, hey, you shouldn't murder, and you shouldn't lie, and you shouldn't envy what other people have, and you shouldn't have sex with people that you're not married to, you listen to that list and you go, oh, okay, I get it. Those are really good things, and those are things that everybody ought to know. Now, the thing on sex you might think needs to be updated a little bit, but you sort of get where the whole thing's going. And the thing is, all of us, if you've ever been at a place in your life where you've been mad enough with somebody that you thought about hurting them physically, when you calm down, you look back at that, and if you did do bodily harm, you felt a little bit guilty about it, like, wish I hadn't done that. If you've ever stolen anything, later you weren't too proud of that moment. Even the lies that we tell, which everybody tells lies, you go, that's not something I'm really proud about. But the command I'm going to talk to you about today, which is in this list of commands that really is intended for our good, there's this command that's intended to us to be a gift. In our culture, we not only violate it, it's like a cultural standard that we ought to violate it, and many of us are really proud that we violate it. And again, it's meant for our good. And even if you're not a Bible person, if you just listen to doctors and psychologists, they'll tell you that violating this command, you do it long term at your own detriment. This is a detriment to your health. It's a detriment to your relationships. That long term, you become the kind of person that you don't want to be when you violate this particular command. But everybody in our culture violates it, and we're sort of proud of violating it. You know what I'm talking about? Well, let me just read this command to you, and just so you know, this is my job over the next few minutes or so to try to persuade you and me to go against a very countercultural thing and to agree with God that what He has asked us to do is good for us to do, and to begin to implement this into our lives. So let me just read it to you. Here it says, God said, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. Now this commandment, you'll notice, God tied to Himself. The Bible said that during the week of creation that God worked and He had this rhythm going. He separated the dry land from the sky. He created the earth and the sky. He made everything in the earth, and God created on the sixth day human beings. It's the climax of all that God had been doing. Male and female, He made us in His own image. And then the writer of Genesis says, and on the seventh day, God finished the work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all the work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that He had done on creation. Now, here in particular, there's something I want to point out to you. You would expect, the way most of us think about creation account, that it would say that on the sixth day, with human beings, God made human beings, and on the sixth day, God finished His work, and on the seventh, He rested. But that's not the way the account is written. It says that God finished His work on the seventh day. What was God creating on the seventh day? Well, God was creating this rhythm, this Sabbath. Now, you may or may not know, I wouldn't expect that you've had time to study this, but all Near Eastern kind of cultures have their own kind of creation story. And most of those stories, including the biblical story, they have a lot in common. The biblical story has some uniqueness about it, but all of them have some commonalities among these Near Eastern creation kind of stories. One of the things that's in common in all of them, except the Bible story, is that the deity in that story, the God of that culture, he creates a place. At the end of creation, he creates a place, a temple, for God himself to reside so that he can meet with human beings. But in Israel's story, in the Bible story, God does not create a place. He does not create a temple. He creates a day. Because, of course, it turns out human beings are pretty good with places. But days, times, we struggle with time. God creates a sacred place in time. He creates a day. He creates a Sabbath. And then the writer says this amazing thing, and God rested from all his work. God himself rested on the seventh day. Well, why would he do that? I mean, all of us know that if you're really any kind of God, I mean, you can't be an unlimited being and do your work and go, whew, that just wore me out. I am so exhausted from my work. God didn't get to the end of his work and go, thank me, it's Friday. God was not exhausted. In this, God is demonstrating something. God is creating a rhythm, and he's demonstrating it for the human beings. That in existence, in this world, there is a rhythm. And of course, in the creation account, he talks about the moon and the stars that he creates, and they have a rhythm, and they'll produce seasons for our world, a rhythm in that. But in this, he creates, there's a weekly rhythm. In this rhythm, there will be work and rest, there'll be activity and reflection, there'll be production, and then there'll be gratitude. He's saying, you need to remember that you are eternal. Remember that your life is about more than the activity you can cram into it between now and the grave. You are eternal. And as surely as you inhabit this moment right now, you will inhabit every moment of eternity. You will never cease to be. So God says, one day a week, I want to invade time with you. I want to create a space and time, and I want you to remember. I want you to worship. I want you to remember that I did not create you limitless. I am limitless. And even though you're eternal, you are not without limits. You need to play, and you need to be renewed physically and emotionally and spiritually. You don't do this, and you will become exhausted and obsessive and fearful and self-preoccupied and irritable and ungrateful, and all the compassion will just be drained out of your soul. Sound familiar to anybody? And you will just skim life. You will skim relationships, and you will skim God, and you will skim your marriage and skim your family. You will skim friendships. You will just be like a rock bouncing across a pond. You will just skim at everything. On the Sabbath, we're to remember what really matters. Why were you made? Why did God create you in this place, in this time? What's your destiny? What were you meant to do on this earth? To whom do you belong? On the seventh day, we remember what really matters. On the seventh day, you remember who you are and whose you are. On the seventh day, you remember for God's sake and for your sake, you remember why you were put on this earth. On the seventh day, you remember that God put a seed of eternity in you, and you are an eternal being, and you will inhabit every moment of eternity. Now, your life is not just about what you can do between now and the grave. You are an eternal being. So in the next few minutes, I want to talk to you about the Sabbath gift. And I want you to remember that when you're adulting, you accept this gift of limits that God has put into the rhythm of life. I want to talk to you about the gift of the Sabbath for Jesus' followers. See, the Sabbath kind of rhythm took a change for Jesus' followers. Again, when Jesus is crucified, then resurrected, and his band of followers comes together to follow him for those 40 days, and then he ascends into heaven. Soon after that, 10 days later, the church begins. The sermon gets preached, and the little band of 100 or so grows to thousands. But when they begin to meet, they move from the Sabbath day of worship, the seventh day of worship, which had always been the rhythm for all of them. They were all Jews. It moves from the seventh day of worship to they begin to worship on the first day of the week. Why the first day? Well, it was on the first day of the week that Jesus had been resurrected. They moved their worship to the first day to commemorate Jesus' resurrection. It was a day of hope. In fact, in early Christian writings, they don't even call it the first day of the week. They call it the eighth day of the week. It's to remind them that God had created a new day. With the resurrection of Jesus, it was a new era, a new day. God had given them 7 days, but when Jesus resurrected, all things were being made new, and there was a new day. This new day, the eighth day, was a day of great hope. And they observed this new day because Jesus had made it very clear that the Sabbath day, it had sort of gotten corrupted, and that it had become an obligation to people, but it had always been not about some legalistic obligations. It had been a gift, and in Jesus' days, a lot of people had turned it into obligation. There were all kinds of rules about it. In fact, if you ever read through the Gospels, you'll see this kind of thing where Jesus is constantly battering over the obligations of the Sabbath. In their day, they had said because God said that you should not work on it, that meant you couldn't carry a burden. Well, when you make a blanket statement like that, then of course you have to define what is a burden. So when iron came into being, they said you can't have anything with iron. If you have shoes and they're nailed together with iron nails, you can't have shoes with iron nails. You cannot wear them on the Sabbath. Which meant, of course, people then began to wear shoes that didn't have iron nails, that were woven together. Even if the woven together shoes were heavier than the shoes with iron nails, and that was more of a burden, you couldn't wear the iron nails. It had become just this legalistic thing that you did. But Jesus was continually saying to people, you weren't made for the Sabbath. It wasn't about you keeping a legalistic day. It was about a gift that God was giving to you to remind you you're eternal, but you're not limitless. In fact, Paul in Romans, Paul, who was a follower of Jesus, who wrote so much of the New Testament and trying to instruct the church in Rome, he says, all days are the same. Some people may hold one day different, but all days are created the same. So this is not about a list of rules of do's and don'ts. So I just want to say, I know some of you listening to me, your schedule, your work schedule in our world, in our culture, requires that you work on Sundays. You have no choice but to work. You should know that there's a lot of evidence that in their culture, in the Jewish culture where the church began, that the first day of the week was a work day for everyone. Of course, in their culture, in the Jewish culture, it was the seventh day that no one worked. But they worshiped on the first day. So every day, every Sabbath, this eighth day, it was always a work day for them. But they continued to set aside this Sabbath rhythm in their life. Even though they would work, they would still set it aside for what God had created. And so I want to challenge you. With everything in our culture that goes against this, I want to challenge you to take the Sabbath gift of limits seriously. To begin to actually observe and to make observing it a priority in your life. And I want to suggest some things to you to think about if you want to actually begin to do this. The first thing that happens once you begin to accept the gift of limits that come with the Sabbath is the word rest. The Bible says that on the Sabbath, God rested. He quit working. In fact, the word Sabbath literally comes from a word that means to cease or desist, to stop, to rest. And if you don't, then the Bible makes clear that you lose something in your life. Now, again, if you're a person who doesn't really take the Bible as something that you have to follow, then maybe you should just look into all the research that's being done in our day. A long scientific study that's just come out about sleep and the need for rest makes clear to us that you violate this at your own risk. It has huge damage that comes to human beings when you don't do this thing of rest in your life. There's a part of you that gets undone when you don't rest. Some of you don't know this about me, but people who know me know this. I'm not a car guy. And what I mean by that is I don't have any ego attached to what I drive. I never have. I've just wanted a vehicle that would get me from here to there. And what that meant for me early in life as not being a car guy that took any glory in the kind of car I drive is I just didn't care. I didn't care about any of it. I didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care about any of it. But in early days, no one taught me that it did mean I still needed to maintain it. So since I didn't care, I also didn't do any maintenance. Early in Becky and my marriage, we didn't have a lot of money, and we had an old LTD that I'd had since I was a young guy. If you don't know what an LTD is, it was this big, huge, honking car. It was really not a bad-looking car for its day and time, and I had a baby blue one that I had bought. And this baby blue LTD had these super long and had super long doors, and mine was a two-door. Well, I didn't do any kind of maintenance on it all. And to not only maintain it, I didn't maintain the body. And it had nicks and dings on it, and I never washed it. I didn't think about those things. And because at that time in our life, we lived in the northern part of our country, in the winter, of course, because of snow and ice, they had to put salt on the road. So we had driven it, and so the body of this car was rusting out. Another thing you don't know if you've never lived in the north is they have potholes in the north. And I know you think we have potholes here. You don't have no stinking potholes down here. They have potholes in the north that will swallow vehicles. Because of that, and because I did not maintain it in any way, my car was out of alignment. In fact, this LTD was so far out of alignment, I had to keep it at a permanent 20-degree turn just to make it drive straight. In addition to that, over time, the interior of the car began to fall apart. This car had these really long doors that they had for some reason decided they would put plastic kind of interiors on it, and it had a plastic handle. Well, over time, pulling this really heavy door that I never oiled to make it close easily, over time, that plastic handle broke off. But I didn't fix that. Eventually, Becky and I just began to use the knob that you would roll the window down to pull the door closed until that broke off, and then we would have to pull up by the window to get in. I'll never forget the day that I pulled into a particular parking lot driving this car. In addition to all the things I've described, the engine of this car was so poorly maintained that it had a little bit of trouble starting. But once you got it started, it also had that thing that I learned people call dieseling, that when you turn it off, it would not stop running for a little bit of time. So I pulled into this parking lot, and I parked, and I'm standing next to my car while it's doing that thing, and I wanted to make sure it did actually finally turn off. I'm standing there, and while I'm standing there, this guy pulls in a shiny Jaguar. It looked brand new, but it was about 20 years old. But he had done such a miraculous job with it. It looked like you could eat off it. I mean, the paint was shining. It was buffed perfectly. And I thought to myself, I didn't know anyone could drive a car that looked like that. When the guy stepped out of the car, he was as perfect as the car, dressed perfectly. And as I stood next to my car with it just dieseling on, he looked at me and with a look that said, I didn't know anybody could drive a car that looked like that. Now, what was the difference between his car and my car? It was maintenance, and several $1,000s, but mainly maintenance. See, the gift of the Sabbath is about human maintenance. It's about putting something into your life that you have to have in your life, and you violate it at your own risk. Eventually, I learned with cars, you can ignore maintenance if you want to, but you will pay. One day, you will pay for the lack of maintenance. God gives human beings this gift, this space and time to remind us you're eternal, but you're not limitless. You have limits, and you must rest. And you violate this at your own risk. God said, I'm creating a Sabbath, and on this day you rest. You just stop. You just take this day from all of your activity. You take your mind and you let your mind rest. You let your soul rest, and this is essential for your health. You must be well rested to live well. Over the long haul, you cannot violate this. And there's a process. And by this process, you restore balance to your life, and you rejuvenate your energy, and you regain perspective. It's like you clear off the windshield of your life, and problems that got bigger and bigger as you got more tired, they get resized into direct proportion. They get appropriately sized in your life. You allow your emotions to come back into check. And most of all, you learn that you can meet God in this space with rest. And you can enjoy God in this space. You can enjoy being in His presence. God says you need to have this day in the rhythm of your week where you just rest. And in that day, you realize that it is possible to have no activity and no frenzy scheduling, where you don't say, I have to fill it full because my life is short, where you just say, no work, no schedule. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to talk about it, God says. You just rest so your body can be refreshed and your emotions can be renewed and your perspective can be restored. The question I have is, are you doing this? Do you have an intention to do it? The real question is, do you trust God enough to do it? Because in the end, this is a trust question. Or are you like a little child who believes you will miss out on something if you don't cram your life full? Are you willing to not say, are you willing to say, God, my devotion to you and following what you've asked me to do is more important to me than my work and my success and my plan? God says, just rest. People, just rest. And you'll discover this amazing thing. You'll discover, there's a real good chance if you'd finally decide that you will rest and do no work, here's what you'll discover. The sun will come up the next day. Because this world, it was running pretty fine before you got born into it, and it will be running fine long after you are done, because your world that you think is your world is not your world. This is your Father's world. And He was doing perfectly okay. And you can rest and trust that He has you right where you will, if you will put this into place in your life. So that's the first word, rest. The second word that I want you to think about that this gift of limits offers is the word reflection. And reflection was a part of this whole thing with God from the very beginning. It was a part of His work of creating. We're told that God creates the heavens and the earth. That was the work that He did. Did you notice how God did His work? God spoke, and it happened. How would you like to be able to work like that? That you just say something, and it just happens. In fact, there's this repetitive kind of strain to Genesis as it talks about the rhythm of God's works. God said, and it was so. But that's not the way we would have it if we did it. If I could say, and it was so, I would say more, and it would be so. But see, the rhythm in Genesis is not just this two-line rhythm. It's longer than that. God said, and it was so, and God saw that it was good, and God said, hey, let's call that a day. That's enough for today. See, if you or I had the ability to just speak things into existence, we would just keep speaking things into existence and just until we were exhausted. And one of the things that is amazing about our God and frustrating to us as human beings about our God is that our God is not in a hurry. It turns out, it appears, from all the things that we can find out, that God took an amazingly long time to do this thing of creating. God would speak, and He would say a day, and He'd just call a day. And apparently that took a really long time. God said it was so, and that's a day. And apparently He waited eons and periods of time before He spoke good. But at the end of all of it, He would look at it and say, well, let's just look at that. That's really, really good. Let's enjoy this. God reflects on what He's done. He savors it. He thinks about it. He sees that it's good. Do you ever do that? If I were to admit one of the greatest failings of my life in my 58 years of life, this has been one of the failings of my life. I did not know it was a failing for a long time. I love progress. I love making progress. I am frustrated by things when they aren't making progress. I want everything going up and to the right, all the charts in my life. And so for most of my life, that's what I pursued. Things being right and things making progress and things going forward. In fact, when things do go right and they go forward, I am right on to the next thing. But over the last few years, in the discipleship process that we've put in place in our church, I've begun to learn this rhythm of life, of slowing down and listening and reflecting. So a few months ago, I was in this period of trying to get this rhythm in my life. And so in the middle of my day of doing the things that I do, I decided that at this particular time I would take a break. And I went out for a walk, and I walked around our church property. I walked out of our office, I walked through the parking lot, and I walked down the gravel road that goes out back. It's generally about a 10 to 12 to 15 minute walk, depending on the speed at which I walk. And when I'm walking back up the gravel road, I'm coming up to the back parking lot of our church, and I notice a mom and her kids. She's helping them get into a van. She had been there for a meeting, and I saw them getting into the van, and they were laughing, and she was helping them. And in that moment, I thought about my wife, Becky. I hadn't planned on thinking about her, but I thought about her. It just came into my mind of Becky and of how much she loves our children and our grandchildren, and not just our children. She loves your children and the students of this church, and she has devoted her life to them. And I thought about her fierce spirit. If you don't know my wife, she's not the most outspoken person like I am, but if you ever try to do verbal battle with her, I'll just give you a clue. You will lose. She has this fierce, awesome kind of spirit. And in that moment, when I thought about my wife and all that she was meant to be, this is the next thought I have. What a gift you have been given to get to do 37 years of your life with her. What a gift you've had. What a life you've had. What an amazing human being she is. What an amazing gift it is that she has been in your life for all these years. I did not plan on having any of those thoughts. I had not been thinking about any of those things. But in that moment, when there was space, when I took a break from trying to make progress, there was space for me. And in that moment, as I walked back to the office, I had that thought of, maybe that's what it's like to see the image of God in a person. And of course, that image is in you. It's in me. It's in the person sitting next to you right now. It's in the person that irritates you at work and in every person in your family. I thought about it in that moment, and I thought, that must be what God thought when he looked at her and he created her, and he thought, that is very, very good. It must have been what God thought about when he thought about you. When God thought about you and he thought, what a gift it's going to be to create John in the world, or Dawn in the world, or Courtney in the world, what it's going to be like to create these human beings in the world. And he saw you, and he saw you without the taint of sin or what our world can do to human beings. And he saw the potential that you had in life. And he thought about the gift that you would bring to this world and what he had intended for you to do. And the joy that he felt in that moment when he thought about you, and he thought, that is very, very good. And for a minute, for a moment, in that moment when I was reflecting, I had a taste of what it must be like. And it was unbelievable. But I'll tell you something. Moments like that don't just happen. You have to create space for it. And when you're in constant task to obligation mode of what do I have to do, moments like that don't just pop in. But moments like that, they can become many Sabbaths where I reflect on the goodness of life and of God. One dad I read about talked about how he realized what a gift his life was, and he's trying to put this rhythm in his life, and he realized that every day at the end of a long day, as he commuted home, he would drive into his house, and his family, which he loved, began to feel like this obligation that they would have demands on him after other people had had demands on him. So he put a rhythm into his life that when he would finally get off the interstate and he would be just about to pull in his house, there was a parking lot nearby, and he would pull in, and for just a few minutes he would sit in the parking lot and he would say, God, in just a moment, I'm going to walk into the house. Help me to see that these are people that are gifts to me. I don't want to miss out on what a gift it is to be a husband to my wife and what a gift it is to be a dad to my children. I do not want to miss out on these moments. Help me to be a loving person in these moments. In that moment, he created a little mini Sabbath. And I was thinking as I read that, what if somehow I could help everybody at Community Christian, all the parents, all the spouses, if I could create in every friend, if I could just say, if I could convince you to say, I'm going to be a Sabbath keeper and I'm going to do this little mini Sabbath every time before I have an interaction with a person, before I walk through the door and say, God, give me the ability to see the person you made them to be. Help me to be a loving person. And he'll do it. You can have a little Sabbath right at the end of every day where you begin this process of it just at the end of the day, just before you go to sleep, that you can go through your day with God and you can think back to the moments of your days and you just bring scenes before your mind and you can go through them scene by scene and you can bring up a good scene and you can say to God, oh God, that was a great moment. Thank you for that moment. Thank you for that person. Thank you for the interaction I have. Of course, if you're like me, there'll be moments that you're not so thankful for, where you didn't get it right, and that'll bring a little moment where you can say to God, God, I missed it that moment. Can you help me? Can you help me learn how to do that the way that you would do it? And he will. There, of course, come moments where you'll remember things that you have problems and you don't know what to do about. And God say, God, I need wisdom for that. What would you have me do in this situation? And if you ask him for wisdom, he'll give you moments. He'll give you wisdom if you'll give a moment where you can reflect on it. And of course, then there'll be things that you're concerned about. And you can say to God, God, here's the things I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about this with my kids, or this with my health, or this with this person I love about. I'm concerned about these things, but God, I have to go to sleep. Since you're going to be awake all night anyway, I'm just going to leave these with you here. And I'll see you in the morning. And he will take care of them during the night. And he will give you rest if you ask. Every day can be this little gift. But are you reflecting? Or are you just skimming through life? I want to give you somewhat of a challenge on this. How much are you taking? To what extent are you doing this? Our culture, just to be real frank, just drives this out of you. Some of you are here and you're accomplishing a lot and you're running real hard from early in the morning till late at night and you're doing really good things. But the truth about you is that Jesus most often is just an afterthought, or just for a moment when you're sitting in a place like this. You don't really think about following him all that much and your soul is empty. There's pride driving you. There's fear driving some of you. Envy is eating at your spirit. What could have been a generous spirit is just being consumed with all the greed of our society. And the conscience that could have been soft to God has just grown hard. You don't know your kids. You don't know your spouse. You don't marvel at the gift that is life. You don't marvel that you wake up in the morning and you suck in air. You don't stand in awe in the presence of the God of this universe who loves you. You're successful maybe outwardly secure, highly thought of, and spiritually dead. And the worst part is, you don't even know it. You don't know that you're missing it. You don't know that you missed out on what was the gift of life because you never reflect. You stay so busy, you run so fast, you do so many things for so many people that you never hear the words of Jesus. You have ears to hear, but you will not hear. You have eyes to see, but you will not see. Will you change? Will you listen? Will you remember the seed of eternity that got planted in your soul? And reflect on what God has given you. Sabbath keepers take this gift and create that space. Finally, it's the word remember. He says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And that word, remember, it keeps cropping up in relationship to the Sabbath. Remember, God says. And then he explains it. He says, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt and I delivered you. Remember a time when you were trapped. Remember when you were stuck. Remember when you thought you were all alone? Remember when you thought there was no hope? Remember when you thought it was all dark and nothing could change? And then he says, remember what happened? Remember, I delivered you. Do you remember what it was like? You remember when you thought you had no hope? Remember when you thought you were all alone and no one cared? Remember when you had no direction? Remember when you couldn't understand why you were created? Remember when your marriage was stuck, when your kids were stuck? Remember it was the strong arm of God that delivered you from the addiction. Remember, God says. And in that moment, something grows inside of you. Sabbath keepers remember. They remember. You know, that's what the whole communion part is about for followers of Christ. Communion, every week in our service, is this time where we remember. We remember that there is a God that says, I love you so much. I don't want you to ever forget that. So I sent my son. I sent Jesus. I sent him to be broken and crushed on the cross. And God says, every time you come together and you take this bread and you drink from this cup, you put yourself in a place where you meet me, and together we remember. We remember my son took that for you. And every time you take the cup and every time you eat this bread, you remember that I gave him for you and that I love you. You remember that I am with you. And you create this sacred place in your life with all the horrible memories and all the painful things that go in our world. We remember we have a Father who loves us so much. And you can't remember that rightly without being changed. You can't. We remember that there is a God that says, I am for you, I am not against you. I will be like a good shepherd to you, and I will walk beside you. And I will grow you up if you'll just follow me and listen. Why would anyone not want to live that way? So in just a moment, we're going to sing a song, and we're going to remember Jesus, and we're going to take the elements, and we're going to remember. And I get it, if you're not a follower of Christ, this may seem weird to you. So when that happens, you can just let it pass by. But for those of us who know him, who follow him, take this moment, create that space, and remember. Let's bow together, and I'll pray. Father in heaven, we are so thankful for you and for how much you love us and that every command you give us is for our benefit. And I repent of how I have bought into society and I have just skimmed through life in pursuit of progress of what I thought I was doing that was good, and I've neglected this gift of rest and reflection and remembrance. And I've too often been cut off from you. I pray for people that are listening and they feel at the same place that we will be serious about creating this space where we meet you in time like you intended. Thank you for your love for us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Now would you stand as we sing this song together and we remember.